introduce him. You all know. I'm Professor Kang, so Professor Kang, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. Okay, everyone. Well, it's great to see everyone once again for the very last time. The religion clauses review, this originally began as a review just for the students who were taking my Con Law 2 class. And the reason it began just for them was because, unlike the other Con Law professors, my Con Law class never went to the religion classes because we never had time. That's the only reason behind it. All the other Con Law professors I know, because they tell it to my face, that they pretty much finished the entire book, but my classes never even come close to doing that, and the religion classes we never finished. So, out of guilt, I do a brief review for my students. But over time, this has become somewhat broadened for the other students as well. We're just going to go over some of the basics of religion clauses review. I suspect my students will find it to be most helpful because they're the most ignorant with regard to this subject. But some of you might find it to be useful for a refresher as well. How to use this review, like I said, it's just basically a very sort of fundamental review, nothing very complicated. Let me explain just a brief overview. Remember, there are two religion clauses in the United States Constitution. There's not one, but there's two religion clauses in the United States Constitution. And a lot of people think that the very first amendment of the US Constitution says that there's a right of free speech. This is totally not true. The very first words in the very first amendment guarantee that you have the right of religious free exercise and that Congress cannot establish religion. I'll quote the language for you verbatim. The very first words in the very first amendment, there's nothing for you to write. Everything that you need to know for the lecture is already here. I'm just going over this because sometimes it's useful just to hear it. So you don't have to write anything. In fact, that would discourage it. I'm very against notes. As my students know, I'm very opposed to that. I think they're useless. I think they're for losers. Don't do it. Everything you need is here. Just listen and try to absorb. The very first words in the very first amendment of your United States Constitution begin as follows. It says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There are two clauses there. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. You know, you notice right away it says Congress. Does that mean that the state and local governments can establish a religion? And does that mean that the state and local governments can infringe on your religion? They can't do that. But the original words of the Religious Free Exercise Clause and the so-called Establishment Clause, it just says Congress. It says just Congress may not establish a religion, and that Congress may not infringe on your religious free exercise. Here's what you need to know with regard to that. Over time, the U.S. Supreme Court has made state and local laws also subject to the Religious Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause over time. What that means is the following. It ain't just Congress who's limited by the First Amendment anymore. It's state and local governments that are also restrained by the First Amendment Religious Free Exercise Clause and the First Amendment Establishment Clause. Now, specifically, I put down a boilerplate here. It's on page 1. If it's the state that's infringing on your right of religious free exercise, you basically write the following. The free exercise, this is on the bottom of page 1, way down there at the bottom, very last paragraph. If it's a state that's infringing on your religious free exercise, or if it's a local government like the school board or the city that's infringing on your religious free exercise, this is what you write, your very first sentence. The Free Exercise Clause prohibits Congress from infringing a person's right of religious free exercise, and then you say the following. Cantwell versus Connecticut, 1940, applied the Free Exercise Clause to the states. Cantwell versus Connecticut, this is the very last sentence of page 1. Cantwell versus Connecticut applied the Free Exercise Clause to the states. You go ahead and say that on the bar exam to indicate to the bar examiners that you know that the original Constitution, it only applies to Congress. But the U.S. Supreme Court extended the protection of religious free exercise to state laws in Cantwell versus Connecticut, 1940. Now I'm going to go a little bit out of order than what is written in the outline. I thought about before the lecture what I should do, and I'm going to go in a little bit out of order than what I usually do. I usually go exactly what the order of the outline is, but over time, I thought about this before the lecture, and I thought it might be better if we go in a slightly different version. I know we just talked about the state and local governments being restrained by the free exercise clause, but I want you to go to page 4. I want you to go to page 4. This is not state and local governments, this is federal government. This is federal government, but I want you to go to page 4. We're going to go back to state and local governments, but for the time being, stay with the federal government. If you have a law passed by the federal government, this could be by Congress, this could be some type of executive order passed by the president or some federal agency, whatever. It could be some policy instituted by the United States Air Force, whatever. Whatever, any federal agency, president, Congress, federal bureaucracy, whatever. If it's a federal law, how do you know when a law infringes on a person's right of religious free exercise and therefore is subject to strict scrutiny and is most likely going to be struck down? How do you know when a federal law infringes on a person's right of religious free exercise and therefore it's going to be subject to strict scrutiny and most likely it's going to be struck down? How do you know? Very simple response. You know if that federal law unduly burdens that person's right of religious free exercise. That's the key phrase. You know if that federal law unduly burdens that person's right of religious free exercise. Then it's going to be subject to strict scrutiny, and most likely it will be struck down. The question is, how do you know when that federal law unduly burdens that person's right of religious free exercise? How do you know this? We're not going to go into every single example with regard to undue burden test. I'm going to give you one right now, and I'm going to give you 2 later. But one example of undue burden is as follows. It's when you have a law that seems to treat 2 people who are religious and non-religious in exactly the same way on the face of the law. But for some reason, that religious person, she feels it harder than that non-religious person. It's when you have a law that seems to treat religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, but for some reason there's that religious person who looks at that law and says, it hurt me harder in my heart. Now, what type of law is that? Here's one example of this. This is Yoder versus Wisconsin. This is actually not on page 4, it's actually on page 3, but I'll give you the facts of Yoder versus Wisconsin. This is an example of a law that treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, and it's concerning a state law. But for now, it'll give you a good example of what the undue burden test is sort of like. Again, this is a state law and not a federal law, but I want you to think about what the undue burden test means. We're going to get to state law later, but for now I'm going to give you this example because it's an easy example to understand. There's a law in Wisconsin that says that every parent has to send their child to a public school or a publicly accredited private school until the age of 12. If that parent does not send his child to a public school or a privately accredited private school up to the age of 12, he's going to go to prison. That parent's going to go to prison. Now, Mr. Yoder, he's a member of something called the Old Order Amish. Does anyone know what Amish people are? Are there any Amish people here? Because I don't want to offend any Amish people who are here. Since we're not going to offend them, I'm going to go ahead and try to offer my account of them. Amish people, you might remember from the movie Witness from like many, many years ago starring Harrison Ford. These are people, and I understand there's something called a show, a reality show. I've just recently gotten a TV, but I've heard from people that there's a show called Amish Mafia or something like that. And basically these are people who live in places in rural Pennsylvania and rural Ohio and parts of rural Michigan. These are people who are extremely religious, who are sort of like a smaller sect of the Mennonite Protestant sect from Germany. They live in their own community. They have no electricity, no running water, and they live on a completely agricultural economy where they make like small foodstuffs and furniture, and they sell that to regular sort of like outside people. Now what's happening is that Mr. Yoder, he's a member of this religious group. That religious group wants the people in that group, including the teenagers, to stay on the farm. Do not leave. Stay on the farm. Marry each other. Have children in the Amish community and stay on the community. They do not want their kids to leave the farm. That is really important. And from their perspective, it makes sense because the more kids come to places like this, meet people like, you, they start seeing that life exists outside of their community. They start seeing that there's more to life than raising horses and livestock and praying and going without electricity. There is alcohol and nightclubs and fun and swearing and sex and good stuff outside their community. And they are not willing to come back. That's the problem. They meet people like you, they become poisoned, and they're not willing to come back. They're not willing to come back. Mr. Yoder, he's very worried about that. So this is what he says. I am not going to send my child to a public school or to a publicly accredited private school. He's going to grow up on the Amish community. He's going to meet only Amish people. He's going to learn and pray. He's going to stay away from drugs and alcohol and swearing. He's going to live a simple life. And he's going to marry a nice Amish girl someday and produce Amish children and so on. That's what he's going to do. That's why Mr. Yoder is keeping him in the Amish community. He's going to face a criminal sentence for doing that. Now look at the law that you have there. Religious people and non-religious people alike, I don't care what your motivation is. Y'all both have to send your children to a public school or a publicly accredited private school till the age of 12. Does that treat religious people and non-religious people differently on the face of the law, or does it treat them equally? It treats them equally. Because there could be some parents out there who may not want to send their kids to a public school or to a publicly accredited private school because they want to teach their own children. They want to homeschool their own children. There are many parents like that, not because of religious reasons, but for whatever. Whatever, it doesn't make any difference. Wisconsin does not care. Here's what the court did. They asked Mr. Yoder, do you think that law violates your right of free religious exercise under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution? And he said, I believe it does. I believe it does. And here's why. Even though that law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, it hurts me harder as a religious man than someone who's not religious. I understand that someone who's homeschooled may not like this law as well, but it hits me harder because now you're making me choose between my duty to my God and going to prison. It hurts me harder that way. You're making me choose, do you want to obey your God or do you want to go to prison? That hurts me harder that way. And of course, I agree with that. It does hurt you harder. It's an undue burden, and you don't have to live like that. It's an undue burden, and you don't have to live like that. That's what the court said. It's an undue burden, and you don't have to live like that. They said that prosecuting Mr. Yoder for keeping his child in the Amish community, that is an undue burden. Even though the law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, it's an undue burden because it treats him harder. It makes him choose between his God and going to prison. It treats him harder than a non-religious person. It unduly burdens his religious beliefs because it makes him choose between prison and God. So the court said this criminal penalty, it does not apply to him. It's an undue burden. It violates a free exercise clause. What's the compelling government interest? Wisconsin, they say, we just want to make sure that everyone knows their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. And the way to guarantee that, the means, they're trying to make sure that everyone goes to either a public school until the age of 12 or goes to a publicly accredited private school. The means chosen, though, were not necessary. They were not necessary according to the U.S. Supreme Court. And they said, if those children on that Amish community can show through a standardized test like the FCAT or whatever, that they know their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, may they not remain in their Amish community without forcing that father to choose between his God and going to prison. And then the Supreme Court said, I believe they can do that. The means here are not necessary. We all want children to know their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, but there's another way we can do this, like through a standardized exam, without putting that father in prison for making him choose between his God and jail time. Does everyone understand that? That's the undue burden test. It's when you force someone who's religious, you want to go to prison or you want to obey your God. Oftentimes the court says, that's too much. It's too hard on his heart. That's an undue burden. The undue burden test, I know this is a state law case, which we're going to come back to in 1 second, but the undue burden test, it usually only applies to federal laws. The undue burden test, it usually only applies to federal laws. If you're wondering, what if it's not a federal law? We're going to get to that in just 1 sec. We're going to get to that in just 1 sec. I know this is not a federal law, but this is somewhat of an anomaly we're going to get to. But if it's a federal law, you apply the undue burden test. Now, what's another example of the undue burden test? I'm going to give you one more example. Thomas versus Review Board. Thomas versus Review Board. Are there any Jehovah's Witnesses here at all? Does anyone believe in God in this classroom at all? You do? Just curious. You did not want to offend. So. Eddie Thomas is a Jehovah's Witness who works in a factory that cuts steel sheeting. There's like big walls of steel, and Eddie's job is to take this like massive saw and just cut through the steel sheeting. That's all he does all day. He has this massive saw, just runs through this massive steel sheeting. He's pretty happy with his job. One day though, the supervisor at the factory says, hey, come here. I don't want you to do that anymore. We got enough guys doing that. I want you to go down a couple of lines in this assembly line. There's something else I want you to do. What do you want me to do, Chief? And he said, okay, I want you to go down a couple of spaces on this assembly line. You know them steel sheeting that you've been cutting over there and like sending down this way? You ever wonder what happened to that? No. Well, now you're going to find out. You're going to go over there, you're going to take that steel sheeting, you're going to fold it round. You're going to take that steel sheeting, you're going to fold it round. You got that? Yeah, I'm going to fold it round. That's right. And then he says, by the way, Chief, when I fold it round, what's that used for? It's like a long tube. It's going to be used as a turret for a tank. We're going to take that folded round long tube. We're going to stick it as part of a turret on a tank. That's where the missile comes out and blows the enemy to 1,000 pieces. So you're going to be part of this process. We're going to fold it. It's going to be a big long tube. That's where the shell is going to be shot through at 200 miles per hour and blow up the enemy into 100 pieces. Are you comfortable with that? I can't do that. I can't do that. And the reason I can't do that is because as a Jehovah's Witness, my God commands me not to contribute to war. So if I fold it like this, it's going to be part of a turret, which you said, Chief, is going to be part of that tank, and it's going to kill people. I can't do that. You're forcing me to choose between my job and my God. And then this is the part where it gets really interesting. The court now said, do you know, wait a second, let me understand this. You're okay with cutting the sheeting? You're okay with that? Yeah. But you're not comfortable with folding the sheeting. Why is that? I can't quite explain, but I mean, there's one thing to cut the steel sheeting, and it's another to like fold it. I mean, it just gives me like goosebumps in folding, you know. It's that much closer to like killing someone. And then this is the second part. This is actually in the facts of the case. His supervisor asked him, do you know there are other Jehovah's Witnesses right now in our factory that have no problems with making the turret? Because they say, I'm not killing anyone, I'm just doing a job. These things may never even be used in war. I'm not responsible for killing anyone. Did you know that, Eddie? And he says, yeah, but you're not comfortable with it. Okay. So you're not going to do it? You're fired. Clean out your stuff. Get out of here. So he says, okay, have a good one. Live in peace, Chief. And so he leaves. And then at that point, he goes to the Indiana Unemployment Division. And he says, hello, miss. I'm Eddie Thomas. I've been fired. Could I collect some unemployment benefits? And then the lady working there asked him, why were you fired? And then he went through the whole story. He said, like, cutting the sheeting and the tubing and the so she said, you know what? That makes no sense to me. the difference between cutting this sheeting, you're good with that, but turning it into a tube, you're not good with that. There are other Jehovah's Witnesses who do not have a problem. I can't give you the unemployment benefits because I think, you know what, I'm going to be totally honest with you. I think you're lying. I just think it's a kooky story, and I think you're lying. So he says, okay, I'm going to sue your unemployment agency in the United States Supreme Court for violating my free exercise clause rights under the United States Constitution. That's exactly what he does. He takes the case to the U.S. Supreme Court. He says that the employment division, remember, he can't sue his employer because his employer is a private actor. Under the free exercise clause, you only have rights against the government. He's going to sue the Indiana Employment Division for denying him the unemployment benefits. And he makes the following argument. He says, Your Honor, the Indiana Unemployment Division is making me choose. Do you want to have the money to be able to survive and eat? Or do you want to disobey your God? Do you want to eat? Or do you want to disobey your God? They're making me choose. Your Honor, do you want to obey your God and not do this? Or do you want to be able to have a job and feed yourself? They're forcing me to choose. Do you want to eat and live, or do you want to obey your God? That is an undue burden, Your Honor. That is totally an undue burden. Chief Justice Berger, who had also written the majority opinion for Yoder, if you're wondering, was that a coincidence? Of course that's not a coincidence. Yoder was written by Chief Justice Berger. He writes the majority opinion here as well. And this is what he says, very important for you. He says that it's not important for the U.S. Supreme Court to try to understand where that guy's coming from as far as his religious beliefs are. It's not important for the U.S. Supreme Court to totally understand that. Because the Indiana Employment Division kept on making the argument, Your Honor, I mean, does this story even add up? Cutting the steel sheeting is fine. Turning it into a tube is not fine. There are other Jehovah's Witnesses who don't have a problem, but he has a problem. Your Honor, please, he's like some kind of he's either a nutcase who doesn't understand the Jehovah's Witness religion, or he's just lying. He's one or the other. And of course, I don't have to understand where he's coming at this from. God works in mysterious ways. So I don't have to understand where he's coming at this from. If God is speaking to Eddie in a way where he can hear it, and maybe he can hear it. Maybe he could hear it. I don't know. Maybe he could hear it. We cannot second guess that and say, I don't think God's talking to you in that way, boy. We can't say that. If God is speaking to him in a way where he understands it, we can't second guess that. As long as he feels that it's presenting an undue burden, and again, undue burden usually it falls under the following. Making him choose between things like the following. Going to prison or obeying my God, trying to eat or obeying my God. In fact, for Yoder, something more specifically, it's forcing you to choose between, do I want to be a good Amish parent by obeying my God, or do I want to go to prison? That's sort of the dilemma Mr. Yoder is stuck in. Do I want to be a good Amish parent and obey my God, or do I want to go to prison? That's the tough dilemma. And here, Eddie has to choose. Do I want to be a good Jehovah's Witness and not start war and obey my God, or do I want to not have money to eat because I've been fired? I can't collect unemployment benefits. It's too hard. It's too hard for a guy like that. Now, that's the undue burden test. One recent example, the very last example of the undue burden test I'm going to give to you is the Hobby Lobby case in 2013, if you remember. Hobby Lobby. Has anyone been to Hobby Lobby here? You guys have? Just like one person brave enough to admit to it. Yes, we have some people, some Hobby Lobby fans up there. We do. Okay, that's good. For those of you who want to go, it's on State Road 7 and University. If you want to go, after the bar and celebrate or anything like that, that's where it is. Hobby Lobby, it is, just to give you some context about what it is, because I think this is important, it is not per se a religious store. It's not in the business of selling Bibles or Christian paraphernalia of any kind. It's basically sort of like a Dollar General for rich, sophisticated people, something like that. They sell little frames and little birds that are paperweights and other types of paperweight. I've never been there, but I've heard stuff like that. Some frames and little grandma porcelain things you put on paper to stuff. So that's what they do. Now, if you remember, President Obama's healthcare plan, the Affordable Care Act, that requires, among other things, it requires private employers to pay for contraceptives, or did anyway. It required private employers to do, among other things, to pay for contraceptives as part of its healthcare insurance policy. Hobby Lobby, this is a closed corporation, as they call it. The shares are not publicly available. It's principally owned by a family. It's not, there's no shares to buy like McDonald's, for example. It's closed corporation. Now this family, very Christian, and here's what they say. Forcing me to buy contraceptives for our employees, it unduly burdens our Christian beliefs. God says, go multiply. How can they go multiply if they have contraceptives? They are less likely to multiply. In order for them to multiply, which really, I mean, that's the major problem in America. We don't have enough multiplying going on by people to increase that as God commands. How can they go multiply if I'm paying for like condoms and like other contraceptive things? We want them to keep multiplying and so on. And it went to the US Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with them. It is an undue burden. When Obamacare tells the owners of Hobby Lobby, you're going to get two choices now. You want to obey your God and not cover your employees' contraceptives? How about if I fine you? How about if I fine you? You pay money to the federal government. You want to do that? And the Supreme Court said, that's an undue burden. You're making them choose between their God and financial penalty. That's an undue burden, according to the US Supreme Court. So always an undue burden means the following. Making a person choose between his or her God and some financial penalty. And it has to be something relatively severe. It has to be something relatively severe. The Hobby Lobby case is so interesting, just one footnote, is because it's not per se a religious group. It's not like a church. It's not like the Catholic Church. If they did that to a Catholic church, that would be so obvious why it would be an undue burden, because the only reason the Catholic Church exists is for religious purposes. But the purpose for Hobby Lobby is to make profit. It sells almost no religious paraphernalia. It is solely to make profit. It's not that different from Microsoft or Google or McDonald's or any other organization like that. But the court said it is nonetheless an undue burden. Now, to recap, if you have a federal law, I know I talked about these two cases which are not federal. I'm going to get back to them in just one sec. But if you have a federal law, like Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, if you have a federal law, you apply the undue burden test. The undue burden test, under that test, we're going to apply strict scrutiny. If a law forces a person to choose between her God and avoiding jail time or some type of financial penalty, avoiding jail time or avoiding some type of financial penalty, or losing one's job, unemployment benefits, something like that. So whenever a person is choose, you want to obey your God, or you want to eat, or you want to go to prison, or you want to face a financial penalty. Usually the court thinks that's an undue burden. Because even though the law treats people the same way, the religious people, they feel it harder because they have to choose. It's not right. That's the court's view. Do that for a federal law. And if you're wondering, but these ain't federal laws, I'm going to get to that right now. Now, state and local laws, you actually do not use the undue burden test. I know you're thinking, but you just did. You just did. Now you're going back on your word. Yeah, I kind of am. But I'll tell you why, but not exactly why I'm not going back on my word. State and local laws, you actually do not apply the undue burden test. You apply a different test. In 1990, the US Supreme Court came up with a totally different test for state and local laws. In 1990, the US Supreme Court came up with a totally different test for state and local laws. They did not use the undue burden test. They used a totally different test. If a state or local law is at issue about whether it violates the free exercise clause, don't apply the undue burden test for the most part. For the most part, do not apply the undue burden test. Instead, you're going to apply a new test that the court created in 1990. This new test is called the Smith test. I know the people who've had other common law professors, you're very familiar with this. This is called the Smith test, 1990. But for my students, I know this is like completely new. Smith test, 1990. Let me give you the facts because I think they're important, and then explain how the Smith interpretation of the free exercise clause works. In 1990, there was this guy named Smith, Alfred Smith. Now, Smith was a member of the Native American church, and as part of their practices as members of the Native American church, they would worship God. But part of worshiping God entailed going to these teepees inside the woods of Oregon where Smith was living. And he would go inside these teepees with his friends who are also members of the Native American church. They would pray to the spirits, they would pray to their gods. And one of the things they would do is that they would smoke some peyote. For those of you who are not familiar with what that is, it's basically a little bright flower that can be crushed and then dried and basically rolled up into like a marijuana joint and then smoked. Now, it's a very mild carcinogen, much weaker than pot, but at that time in Oregon, it's considered to be illegal to do that. It was a crime to smoke peyote. But Smith did this. He wanted to be closer to his God, and one way to do this, of course, for the Native American religions, some Native American religions, is to smoke peyote. His employer found out what he did, and his employer asked him, did you smoke peyote this weekend? Because I heard you did. Yeah, I did. And he says, okay, you're fired. And then, what? How can you fire me? Well, first, it's against the Oregon criminal law, and number two, you work as a drug rehab counselor. Right. Right, man. Right. And so he left. And he did what every single person in these common law cases does. He goes to the unemployment office in Oregon and he says, good afternoon, ma'am. I was recently terminated from my position in the drug rehab program where I was working, and I am here to seek unemployment benefits because of my employment termination. And she says, and may I ask, as part of this, why you were terminated? For breaking a criminal law in the state of Oregon by smoking peyote. And she says, well, I mean, you were fired for cause. You were fired because you broke a criminal law, number one, and number two, you work at a drug rehab center and you can't smoke illegal substances there. I cannot reward you with unemployment benefits. And he said, very well, madam. I will sue you and the Oregon Employment Division for violating my First Amendment religious free exercise clause rights. And that's exactly what he did. The case comes up to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1990. Justice Scalia has the case. Chief Justice Berger is no longer on the court. He's died at this point. Scalia is on the court at this point. And Justice Scalia, he comes up with a brand new rule. He says it's actually not new at all. Sorry, he says it's not new at all, but he says it's totally just like, he's just following precedent. That's what he says. But he's not actually doing that. I mean, in some ways, he might not actually be doing that, but he comes up with a test. He says it's not a new, it's just plain old same stuff that the court's been doing. And this is what he says. The way we handle free exercise clause cases for state and local laws is as follows. There's some rumor I've been hearing about the undue burden test, how if a law forces a person to choose, even if the law is okay on its face, does not discriminate against religious people. There's some rumor that I've been hearing about how if the law forces you to choose between your God and like what? Like going to prison or something like that? That it's a violation of the free exercise clause? Some rumor I've been hearing in the court. I don't know about this undue burden test. I've never heard about this exactly. But I do know this. If a law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same on the face of the law, you know what I call that? I call that a good old-fashioned good constitutional law. And if you are a religious person and what did you say? You feel hurt in your heart? Hey, everyone pains a little bit, and I really could care less about your pain in your heart, okay? Everyone feels pain in their lives. You're not going to get off that easily, buddy. If a law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, I call that a good old-fashioned, good old American law, and you're going to have to comply with that sucker. That's what he says. That's what he says. Now go back to this. The Oregon Employment Division says the following. I don't care why you broke the law, but if you broke the law and that was the reason why you were fired, you're not going to get employment benefits from us. If you were fired because you broke the law, and that law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, you're not going to get any unemployment benefits from us. We treat people exactly the same. Now, think about that peyote law. Does it only go after religious people? It goes after anyone. who smokes peyote. I don't care if God told you to smoke peyote. I don't care if you were just curious. It makes no difference. Everyone's going to be subject to the same punishment. There's no discrimination against religious people. That law is going to be subject to rational review. Is there a legitimate government interest? Yes. Basically, we're trying to prohibit people from ingesting something that could be dangerous. Are the means rationally related? Yeah, there's some medical evidence that it could be dangerous under some circumstances. The denial of unemployment benefits, the same thing. Is there a legitimate government purpose for denying unemployment benefits for people who were fired because they broke the law? Yes, because we don't want to reward crime. Are the means rationally related? Yes, they're rationally related. Everything is fine. So Justice Scalia says, we ain't going to do any of that undue burden test. We ain't going to do that hippie commie thing anymore. We're going to do it the same. We're going to do it the good old-fashioned American way. If the law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, everybody going to have to apply with it. And I don't care about the pain in your heart. I don't care to hear about what God making you choose. I don't want to hear any of that stuff. If the law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, that's a good old-fashioned American law. You're going to pass rational review. That's what he says. But he leaves open two exceptions because he can't overrule this. This was decided back when he was working as a law professor. Yoder and Thomas, this was decided before he became a Supreme Court justice. He can't overrule this. He doesn't have enough votes on the court to overrule this. He says, so if a law treats people exactly the same, if it's a state law, not a federal law, the federal law is still subject to the undue burden test. But if a state or local law, if it treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, you're going to have to obey it with these two exceptions in mind. Yoder and Thomas, those are the only two exceptions. Cases like that. Cases like Yoder and Thomas are the only two exceptions to the Smith test. And if you're wondering, what kind of exception? Well, Yoder is one type of exception. Yoder, if you remember in Yoder, for the students who went over it, there is a fundamental right under the 14th Amendment Liberty Clause interest for families, for parents to be able to raise their kids as they see fit. Do you guys remember that, who are not my students? There's a 14th Amendment Liberty Clause interest for parents to be able to teach their kids as they see fit. And here's what Justice Scalia said. I'm going to let this slide and do this undue burden test for the following reason. It's kind of a hybrid between two different rights. It's Mr. Yoder saying, I got a 14th Amendment Liberty Clause interest as a parent to be able to teach my children as I see fit. That's your first fundamental right. And because of that, he gets to also get this undue burden test as kind of a reward for that. This is called a hybrid example. So Scalia introduced the following idea. If you can show me that the law, the state law I'm talking about, if you can show me that state law violates some other fundamental right, I'm going to let you do that undue burden test. But only if you can show me that it violates some other fundamental right besides your right of religion. If you can show me that, I'm going to let you do the undue burden test. Does everyone understand that? Okay. Does anyone need that repeated? Everyone's good? Okay. Thomas versus Review Board, there's no fundamental right to have unemployment benefits. You just don't. But Scalia said the following. He's really crafty. He's really smart, actually. He said the following with regard to Thomas. He said, okay, that one I'm going to let slide too for the following reason. Because the man's got to eat. Man's got to eat. That's what he said. That's literally what he said. He said, you cannot force an individual to choose between obeying his God and the fundamental materials of his sustenance. Basically, he's trying to say, you can't force a man to either obey his God or eat. I wish I could have written that because it would have sounded better. It sounds more biblical that way. You cannot force a man to choose his God or eat. But that's the other reason. These are the only two exceptions you watch out for. If you have something like this, apply the undue burden test, and you're going to strike down that law. Unemployment benefits. Unemployment benefits is your one other exception. Or if you can show that the state law violates some other fundamental right, then you're going to get the benefit of that undue burden test. But if you can't show that that law violates some other fundamental right, or that the state law it infringes on your right to get welfare benefits, you're going to go back to Scalia's loopy, like, straight edge test, which is basically if a law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, you all got to comply with it. And I have a couple of examples here I want to go over with you on page 2 about what Justice Scalia's law would look like. Example number 2, I want you to just cross that out. My bad. I must have been smoking peyote when I wrote it. Just cross that out, the second example. The second one about, it says U.S. Department of Interior. Cross that out. Just cross that one out. Go to the first example. You have Ted. Ted believes that Satan commands him to kill people. This happens with a lot of murderers, actually, with some murderers. Florida has a prohibition against murder. It doesn't care whether you're killing people because of God or Satan, or whether you're doing it for purely secular reasons. If Ted is convicted of murder, he can't overturn his conviction because he was prosecuted under a law that treated religious and non-religious people in the same way. Neither of you may murder. Do you see that prohibition against murder? If it treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, that guy who said that God commanded him to do it, he's not going to get off the hook. He's not going to get the benefit of the undue burden test. Does everyone see this? Because that law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same. And that's a state law. That's a state law. If it were a federal law, then we're in something totally different. If we're in federal law, like in Washington, D.C., that would be undue burden test. Does everyone see that? But if it's a state or local law, we're going to stay with Justice Scalia's one for one, this for that, equal balance test, where he says, y'all got to comply with it. That's Scalia's test. Y'all got to comply with it. But if we're in Washington, D.C., that's when that murderer's lawyer can say, but Your Honor, he's still not going to get off the hook because it's so totally different from like raising your child or like trying to get unemployment benefits. This is murder. But still, the undue burden test would be available for him if it were a federal law, like in Washington, D.C., or if it were a federal crime. Skip the next example and go to Kara. This Kara example was actually literally taken from the Sun Sentinel several years ago. Kara is a high priestess of a religion that requires new members to pay for sex with Kara in order to retain membership. Kara is prosecuted for prostitution. May she overturn her conviction as a violation of the free exercise clause? No, totally out of the question, because that law against prostitution, it makes no difference whether the person did it because God told her to, or whether because she's just trying to make money. It's just totally irrelevant. The law is going to be subject to rational review. Does everyone see that? But again, if it were a federal law, we're back to the undue burden test. If it were back to a federal law. Next example, the IRS will exempt all charitable organizations except churches. This violates the free exercise clause and will be subject to strict scrutiny, which it will fail. Do you see why? Because that law treats religious people and non-religious people totally different. It's only when the state law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, that is when you're going to get rational review, unless it comes under one of these two exceptions. But if that state or local law, if that treats religious people in a disadvantageous way, if it discriminates against them, that's going to earn strict scrutiny under Scalia's test. If a state or local law, it disadvantages religious people, if it, on the face of the law, if it discriminates against religious people, that's going to be subject to strict scrutiny. Next example, and if you one more example with regard to what's an example of someone who of a law that explicitly discriminated against religious people. In 1990, the city of Hialeah is responsible for this. For some of you who might know this, city of Hialeah versus Church of the Lukumi Babaluai in 1990. The facts were as follows. The churches of Lukumi Babaluai, they practice a form of voodoo, and as part of this practice, they have to sacrifice birds and goats. Yeah, I know, killing animals sounds awful, like to eat them or something like that. But goats and pigeons and such, they have to sacrifice them. But the worst part is they sacrifice them in the backyard of their house. And the neighbors, they hear the goats bleating and screaming. They hear the pigeons, screaming. Sure, you said, oh, just a second ago you were like, and now you laugh at the pigeons being tortured. They do this, and the neighbors are very upset. They contact the city of Hialeah and the police department there, and the city of Hialeah, they pass a law to prevent the killing of animals in the backyards. But here's where they went totally wrong. They wrote in the law, no person without a license from the city of Hialeah may sacrifice any animals for religious purposes. No, if you were an intern there working, Mr. Mayor, you can't write this. Why? What's the problem? Well, I mean, the part about religious purposes, you're discriminating against religious groups. Any judge is going to see that and strike this down. Probably take us out to the woodshed for doing this. We can't put this in here. I think we can. And he went along and went and did this. Now, that's subject to strict scrutiny because even under Justice Scalia's formulation, if you have a state law which discriminates against religious groups, that's going to be subject to strict scrutiny. Was there another way that Hialeah could have gotten away with this? No sacrifice of animals in a private institution unless you have a license from the city, like in an abattoir or some type of butchery where animals are supposed to be slaughtered. Unless it's a place like that, you can't do that. That would have been the intelligent thing to do. And then the Church of the Lukumi had no argument because they could not make the undue burden argument because the law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same as the state law. That would be subject to rational review. But what did Hialeah do? Why? Why did they do this? They were smoking peyote. What were they doing? There was this crazy. The law obviously discriminated on the face of the law. Now, again, keep the following exceptions to mind. You're going to apply this test where you're going to say if the law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, you're going to apply rational review. The only exceptions are as follows. If the state law treats religious people in a negative way, if it discriminates against them, that's strict scrutiny all the way. Or there are these two exceptions too. Even if the law treats religious people and non-religious people exactly the same, these types of people with these types of problems, they can ask for, Your Honor, I would like me some of that undue burden test. And they're going to get it. They're going to get it. If they can show that it's with regard to unemployment benefits, they're going to get it. Or if that person can show that there's a violation of another fundamental right, then he says, can I get me some of that undue burden test? You're going to get it, boy. You're going to get it. You deserve it. But it has to look like this. A violation of another fundamental right, then you're going to get that undue burden test. Or the denial of unemployment benefits, then you're going to get the undue burden test. You're probably going to win it too. If it's a federal law, always undue burden. You got that? Undue burden for federal law all the time. Now, we got about 15 minutes left. That's more than enough time for us to go through the Establishment Clause. By the way, you guys having a good summer? I forgot to ask. You guys having a good summer? What are your plans for the summer? Anyone doing anything fun over the summer? No? Okay. The religion clauses. The religion clauses of the U.S. Constitution, there's two of them. There's two religion clauses, the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause. There's two of them. The Free Exercise Clause says that Congress or state and local governments cannot infringe on your right of religious free exercise. We just talked about that. But there's the second part. Congress or state and local governments, they cannot establish a religion. Congress or the state and local governments, they cannot establish a religion. Congress or the state governments, they cannot establish a religion. This is page 5. Let's get to how it works. Oh, actually 4. Let's get to how this works. Here's what I want you to say if you have an Establishment Clause question where the law is not passed by the federal government but passed by state and local governments. Go ahead and write this boilerplate on the bottom of page 4 for Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause prohibits Congress from establishing a religion or preferring religion over non-religion. If the law was passed by a state or local government, you say that Everson versus School Board, if you want to put 1947, applied to the Establishment Clause to the states. Look at what the Establishment Clause says. A lot of people think totally wrongly that you must have a separation between church and state. Where does it say that in the U.S. Constitution? Where does it say that in the U.S. Constitution? There's no language that says there must be a separation between church and state. Where'd that come from then? That comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Union back in the early part of the 19th century. That's part of a letter that he wrote to a bunch of priests. He says, I believe that there should be a wall of separation between church and state. I thank you, my good gentlemen, for reading this. That's what he wrote. But there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that says that. Instead, the Constitution says something much more favorable to religion. It says, you don't need no separation between church and state, but you, the government, cannot establish a religion. Wow. You cannot establish a religion. That's the only thing you can't do. You want to support religion? That's fine. You want to help out churches? That's fine. You just cannot establish a religion. That gives a lot of power to religious groups. The only thing Congress and the state and local governments are prohibited from doing, they cannot establish a religion. Now, what does this mean, that Congress and the state and local governments cannot establish a religion? There are a couple of different tests that the U.S. Supreme Court has been fooling around with for the last couple of years, but the test that the majority of the Supreme Court has always used has been the so-called Lemon test. Lemon versus Kurtz from 1971. This is the test that you'll be tested on for the bar exam. There are different tests that the Supreme Court has fooled around with, but it's never garnered the majority. It's the Lemon test you'll be tested on for the bar exam. And here's the way the Lemon test goes. You know there's been an establishment of religion if the law satisfies all three of the following. All three of the following, they have to be met in order for the law not to violate the Establishment Clause. Sorry, let me explain. All three of the following, the Lemon test, all three of the following, they must be satisfied in order not to violate the Establishment Clause test under the Lemon versus Kurtzman. Number one, the law must have a secular purpose. If you want to avoid a violation of the Establishment Clause, you have to show that the law has a secular purpose. Not a religious purpose, but a secular purpose. That's why the law was passed, to have a secular purpose. Number two, the law's primary effect must neither advance nor inhibit religion. The law's primary effect must neither advance nor inhibit religion. Another way of saying that is the law must have a secular effect. It's kind of redundant. Number three, the law must not excessively entangle government and religion. The law must not excessively entangle government in religion. Now let's break these things down and talk about what does that mean to have a secular purpose, and what does it mean not to have a secular purpose, and what is excessive entanglement anywhere. Here's some examples of that. What is not a secular purpose? Page 5, here's some examples. Not a secular purpose. A law that required every public school classroom to post the 10 Commandments. Where I used to live in South Central Kentucky, there used to be a school that did that, a public school. That does not have a secular purpose. If you're wondering, the school said in its defense the following. Actually, we beg to differ on that because we do have a secular purpose for the 10 Commandments. Like the first one, for example, you should not steal from your neighbor or kill your neighbor or covet thy wife and so on. The reasons we have that, those are all secular truths. Non-Christian people believe in that as well. Atheists even believe in some of those as well. That's their argument. But the court said, if you believe that, why don't you just say, instead of 10 commandments, God commands you to do these things, why don't you just say, number one, hey guys, 6th graders, don't forget, don't, kill your neighbor, don't covet your wife, that kind of stuff. Don't do that. Don't do that. That's not good. Why don't you just say that instead of God commands you? That's what the 10 Commandments say. God commands you not to do these things. So there's no secular purpose for that. You may say there's a secular purpose, but it says God commands you. That's not a secular purpose. Number two, a law requiring teachers to hold a 1-minute session during class for prayer or meditation by students. This happened in a public school in Rhode Island. The Rhode Island public high school, they said that we're going to have every day in our public high school, we're going to have a 10-minute moment of reflection. And what that means is the following. For those Christian students, is to reflect on their relationship with God. And for those heathen students, it's for you to reflect on your relationship with the devil and that kind of thing. And the court struck it down. The court struck it down for the following reason. Notice how crafty the Rhode Island School Board was. Your Honor, I'm sorry. Our secular purpose is to promote reflection, which both Christian children and heathen children can both do. That was their argument. It is not exclusive to Christians. Heathens may also do this. That was their argument. It's very crafty of them to do that. There's this other, everyone can do this. Atheists, all those other people can do this as well. Very crafty. The court struck it down by saying, if that's what is the purpose behind this? And just to reflect and say, why don't you just say that when we don't encourage any prayer of any type, and we just want students to reflect on their studies or something, or to reflect on becoming a better student. Why not? Why say reflect? These children, please reflect on your relationship with Jesus, and please, these children reflect on your relationship with, your heathenness and so on. I mean, why do that? Why not just say, have a quiet time? To give you a really easy example of this from elementary school, everyone remembers quiet time here, yes? Everyone just, we should have this more often in law school where, you put down your head like this and everyone just relax for like 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes, do that. They could have done that, but they promoted a reflection time for God, and that's why they got it wrong, even if they had an alternative purpose. Watch for that on the bar exam, where the government tries to get around it by saying, no, Your Honor, I mean, we have a secular purpose. I mean, we have a religious purpose too, but there's also a secular quality to it, where we're trying to promote reflection by non-religious students. Or the 10 Commandments can also be appreciated by non-Christians. Watch for them trying to weasel out of that. The court's never going to go for it. If they're they can't have their cake and eat it too. If there's a religious purpose and then they show there's a non-religious purpose, that does not cancel it out. That does not cancel it out. Well, we have this religious purpose on it, but we have this heathen purpose as well. That does not cancel it out. The court does not like that. It's like putting 1 drop of gasoline into a vat of water. That does not cancel it out. It ruins the entire water. They just don't like that. Next example, a law requiring public school teachers to teach creation science. This happened in Arkansas and Alabama. A law requiring public school teachers to teach something called creation science, a theory that there is scientific proof for the existence of a higher being, if the teachers also teach biological evolution. Same pattern, do you see that? Where the school's trying to say, this actually happened in Arkansas. I actually talked with a lawyer who was responsible for defending that school board, who actually did not himself believe it, but had to. The school board did the following. They said that those students who wish to learn the Word of God and show why science supports the belief that God actually exists, please come into this classroom here. And then for those devil children, please go into your biology class next door. Now, do you see that? Do you see what they're trying to do? It's the same thing as the other examples where they say, we have this segregated, we're trying to do both. We love everybody. We're trying to do both. Do you see it? Watch that pattern on the bar exam. The Supreme Court does not like them weaseling out like that. They do not cancel each other out. They say, this is like an afterthought you guys have made as a pathetic apology for having this creation science program. It's just like an afterthought to avoid getting caught. And so the court does not like that. It does not cancel out. All 3 examples that I've given you, they're all sort of the same structure in terms of the factual pattern. They're trying to cancel it out, the government is, but it's not going to work. The last example, posting the 10 Commandments inside the county courthouses, also in Kentucky. Same argument, they're trying to get criminal defendants or people who are guilty of wrongdoing, confess your sin. Confess your sin, my friend, this kind of thing. But again, it says God commands you to. And of course, don't do that, just say, tell the truth. Now, what is a secular purpose? This is Arabic numeral 2, secular purpose. McGowan versus Maryland, 1961. You have a law requiring businesses to close on Sundays. And why is it Sundays? Why not some other day? Because it's the Christian Sabbath. It's to the exclusion of other groups which do not celebrate the Christian Sabbath. But the court, interestingly enough, it said, see, that's not an establishment of religion for the following reason. Watch for this pattern. The court said, if you have a practice that's been done by the government for a long time and it's widely accepted, that is not that is no longer a religious purpose anymore. If you have a government practice that's been done for a long time, everyone takes Sunday off. It's been so long we've been doing this, I can't even remember when was the last time we didn't take Sunday off. Watch for them doing this a long time. The government says no businesses will be permitted to open on Sundays. It's been happening for a long time. And it's widely accepted. People who are not Christians, they expect on Sunday, that's my day off. That's my day off. People who are not Christians, people who are not churchgoers like my family, for example, people who are wayward, awful Catholics like my family, we still go Sunday. It's my day off. I mean, I'm not a practicing Catholic anymore, but I still feel like it's my day off. We look for a practice that's been widespread and long-standing. Widespread and long-standing. Then the court says that's become a secular practice now. Football, Super Bowl Sunday. Super Bowl Sunday. They don't call it Super Bowl Wednesday. They call it Super Bowl Sunday. Long-standing practice that's been widely accepted. Then the court says that it's been so long, no one even remembers why we've chosen Sunday anymore. No one really cares. Watch for that. Then that's not likely to make it a violation of the Establishment Clause. The primary effect, secular effect, is it a secular effect? Go to the next page, page 6. What advances a religion? This is an example. It's any law there was a law which prohibited any employer from requiring her employer to work on the employee's Sabbath. The Supreme Court said this violated the Establishment Clause because its primary effect was to advance religion at the expense of non-religion. Atheists or agnostics don't have the legal right to be exempted from work in this way. Let me repeat that. This is the Thornton versus Calder case. It's a pretty interesting case. You have this law that says that every private employer, this is what the law said. your employee, you got to give that boy his day off on his Sabbath. And I don't care whether his Sabbath is Sunday or Saturday. You got to give that, I'm telling you as the law, you got to give that boy his day off if he's your employee. That was struck down as a violation of the Establishment Clause because there's no secular effect to it. Because, hey chief, I'm an atheist. I don't really believe in God, but you know, those other two guys who work with me in the stacking the boxes, you know, they believe in God, and so they have Sunday or Saturday off. Can I get like an atheist like Wednesday off? Oh, hell no, boy, you're gonna get no day off. See, that's the problem, because they're favoring religion over non-religion. They're favoring religion over non-religion. That's a violation of the Establishment Clause. That's what it means to establish a religion, is when you favor religion over non-religion. The court doesn't like that. You can treat them both the same, but you can't favor one over the other. If you favor religion over non-religion, that's a violation of the Establishment Clause. You come that much closer to establishing that religion. That's the court's view. Now, what else? This is also a very interesting case, has a secular effect. A federal law prohibits discrimination by private employers against employees because of the latter's religion. This is a pretty interesting case. This is about the Mormon Church, but we could talk about it in terms of the Catholic Church. There's one exception to this, where the law can permit religious groups to do things that private groups cannot do, specifically forms of discrimination. Religious groups can discriminate under the Constitution. They can discriminate without getting busted if they're discriminating for purposes of religious employment. Catholic Church is an easy example. If someone who does not accept Jesus as his Savior, if he applies for a job to try to become a priest in the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church can say, you kind of failed the first part of the test. So they can go ahead and discriminate against that person. Now, if a law permits the Catholic Church to so discriminate against that person, at that point, that law, it is not a violation of the Establishment Clause, because that church is discriminating for purely religious reasons. If not the Catholic Church, let's say, for example, it was like FIU, and FIU refuses to hire Catholics, and there was a law that said you can do that too. See, that would be a violation of the Free Exercise Clause, or if they said you can only hire Catholics, that would be a violation of the Establishment Clause. But the thing to keep in mind is the following. If you have a church that discriminates against hiring or firing because of religious reasons, like hiring a priest, for example, something like that, at that point, if the law permits that to happen, that is not a violation of the Establishment Clause, even if religious groups have that benefit, but private employers who are not religious don't have that benefit. It's not actually favoring religion. Does that make sense? It's not establishing it. Government can't get involved in excessive entanglement. There are a lot of examples of this happening, but one easy example is as follows for excessive entanglement. The federal government or state and local governments, they cannot give cash amounts directly to religious schools. They cannot give cash amounts directly to religious schools. They can set up voucher programs, which is different for parents to be able to go send their kids to religious schools, but they can't give direct cash payments to a religious school. And the reason is because then the government has to monitor that religious school to make sure that they're not using that money for religious purposes. Because if they're using the money for religious purposes, that would be excessively entangling the government. In other words, they would have to send some guy from the government bureaucracy, and he would always have to be hanging around that religious school and saying, you know, is this a religious purpose or is this not a religious purpose? You're basically making that guy who works for the government into like a de facto priest for that church, because he gets to determine what's religious and what's non-religious. And that's just not a situation where the government should get involved. That's excessive entanglement in that sense. One sort of example with regard to that, and then we'll wrap up. True example, when my older child was going to school in Kentucky, this is sort of in like the semi-rural part of Kentucky, not like Louisville. She was going to the Bowling Green Christian Academy, this very ultra-conservative Christian school at that point. And the teacher taught her something, and here, make your call about whether this is supporting religion or not. She was learning the concept of infinity in math. Specifically, you know, the point between 0 and 1 on the ruler, if you keep getting closer and closer to 0, you'll actually never really get there because it'll be like 0.00, like 1.00. When you can't, you'll never get there. And then this is where her teacher explained it. She said, Carissa, the reason that we can never get to 0 is because it's infinity in a sense. It's like God. There's no beginning, there's no end. So math in this way is kind of related to his work. And I thought that's very interesting. That's a really interesting argument. I thought it was kind of interesting anyway. And then if a government bureaucrat was there, he would have to, whoa, time out on that one. Did you just go all religion on me with the money I gave you? Or is that math? And it's up to that government bureaucrat to make up his mind about whether that's religion or math. That's excessive entanglement. Do you see that? Because that government worker has now become the priest for that church, saying this is what Christianity means to me, and this is what it means to you. You can never have that relationship. That's why it's excessive entanglement. It's a violation of the Establishment Clause. Under the Establishment Clause, there's no test to apply. Instead, you just ask, is there a secular purpose? Is the primary effect secular? And does the law involve excessive entanglement between the government and religion? There's no test per se to apply. You guys get any questions? No?
What about being able to discriminate based on religion if you're a church?
Yes.
You kept saying priest. Does it matter what the person's job is as a church?
Yes, it has to be something intimately tied to the function of the church. If it's someone who works, for example, as a groundskeeper at the church, that has nothing, or an accountant at the church, that has nothing to do with the church. If that person prepares the taxes for the church, that has nothing to do with the functions of the church. Good question.
How is Smith and Thomas not similar cases?
How are they not similar?
They're both for benefits, yeah.
Yes, good question. Great question, great question, great question. Thomas, he did not break the law.
Okay, so if they break the law, it's...
Great question. How are they different from each other? Thomas ain't no criminal. He ain't no criminal. Thomas ain't no criminal, but in Smith, Mr. Smith, unfortunately, he broke the criminal laws of Oregon. So that's the key difference between the two, is that he broke a criminal law, and therefore he's not entitled to the undue burden test.
And back to that, quitting versus getting fired, it made no difference, right? Because he quit, saying like, I don't want to make change. So he quit.
If he was fired, it would not have made any difference either, because he would have been fired for reasons that were, for the purposes of the free exercise clause, groundless. Like, he should not have been fired for that reason.
Right.
But I think criminal law is the one that's the linchpin that differentiates the two cases.
What was the term that you used just now when you were talking about that that you could only be hired or discriminated for being hired, fired at church if it was like tied to?
If it's intimately associated with the church, if it's like an essential part of the church. So a lawyer for the church, for the most part, I just don't see that as being intimately related to the church. But someone who's a Sunday school teacher, there's a job that's intimately related to the church.
Okay, other questions? If not, first let's thank Professor Kang very much.